My name is Elena Vance, I'm 41 years old, and for 15 years I let my husband believe I was the quietest woman in every room he walked into. That belief was going to cost him everything. It was a Thursday, the 9th of October, 7:15 in the evening, and I was standing in the private dining room of the Aldermore Club on St. James's Street in London, wearing a navy Roland Murray dress my husband had picked out for me that morning because, in his words, it photographs well. Around my neck sat a diamond necklace he'd had delivered to the house at noon, still in its velvet box, no card, no note. Just a driver at the door and a text message that read, "Wear this tonight. Sit, smile, let the men talk." I sat. I smiled. I let the men talk. Across the table, my husband, Julian Vance, CEO of Vance Shipping and Logistics, was laughing at something that wasn't funny, the way he always laughed when he needed a room to like him. Beside him sat a man I'd never met before that night, a heavy-set Ukrainian-British investor named Viktor Kozlov, who didn't smile at all. Kozlov's eyes moved around the table like he was pricing the furniture, and twice, I caught him looking at me the way you look at something you already know the ending of. I didn't know yet what was on the table between them. Not the real version. What I knew was this: Vance Shipping had gone quiet on its quarterly filings for 2 consecutive periods, our accountant of 9 years had resigned in July without explanation, and 3 nights earlier I'd woken up at 2 a.m. to find Julian's side of the bed empty and the light under his study door still on. I had been a forensic accountant before I became Julian Vance's wife. 10 years at Ashcombe and Reyes in Canary Wharf, tracing shell structures and laundered capital through logistics companies not unlike my husband's own. I left the firm the year our daughter Sophia was born with a congenital heart defect that required 3 surgeries before she turned 6. Someone had to be home. Someone had to sit in hospital corridors doing mental math on medical bills instead of forensic ledgers. That someone was me, and Julian never once thanked me for it. He just started introducing me at dinners as my wife. She doesn't really do the business side. He believed that sentence. That was his first mistake. At the table, Kozlov leaned toward Julian and said something in a low voice about the Rotterdam corridor and queue for liquidity, and Julian answered too quickly, the way people answer when they've rehearsed. I picked up my wine and didn't drink it, because I'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to become invisible in a room full of men discussing money is to hold a glass and look bored. Elena doesn't follow any of this, Julian said suddenly, patting my hand like I was a well-behaved dog. Numbers put her to sleep. Don't they, honey? I smiled at him. Completely. Kozlov's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Lucky man, he said to Julian. A wife who signs where you tell her and asks nothing. Nobody at that table noticed my hand tighten around the stem of my glass. Nobody noticed because I made sure of it. 15 years of marriage teaches you exactly how to arrange your face. That morning, before the necklace, before the club, before any of it, I had gone looking for Sophia's medical trust statements. Her cardiologist at Great Ormond Street had recommended a 4th procedure, not urgent, but strongly advised before her 16th birthday in March, and I wanted to check the trust balance before I brought it up with Julian, because for the last year, every conversation about money in our house ended with him saying, "Not now," and leaving the room. I couldn't find the statements in the filing cabinet where they'd always lived. So I did something I hadn't done in over a decade of marriage. I opened Julian's laptop. He'd left it unlocked on the kitchen counter, screen still glowing from whatever he'd been doing at 2 a.m. the night before. I told myself I was only looking for one folder. Trust fund, Sophia. That's all I wanted. What I found instead was a folder labeled VS Holdings, Meridian Transfer, dated 3 weeks earlier, containing incorporation documents for a company called Meridian Cargo Partners, registered in the Isle of Man. And on the signatory page, under Authorized Financial Controller, was a signature I recognized instantly, because I'd spent 10 years perfecting it before I ever married the man who was now forging it. It was mine. My old professional license number from Ashcombe and Reyes, a license I'd let lapse in 2011, sat printed beside a signature I had never made, on a company I had never heard of, that had received, according to the incorporation filing, an initial capital transfer of £340,000 4 days earlier. I sat at that kitchen counter for 11 minutes without moving. Then I heard Julian's car in the driveway, closed the laptop exactly the way I'd found it, and went upstairs to get dressed for a dinner I now understood I was not attending as a wife. I was attending it as a witness to whatever he was about to do to me. Back at the Aldermore Club, dessert came and went, and Kozlov finally said the number out loud. $25 million. An investment into Vance Shipping's Rotterdam-Antwerp freight corridor, structured through 3 intermediary entities, the first of which, though Kozlov didn't know I'd already seen the paperwork, was Meridian Cargo Partners. $25 million clears the debt covenant with Halstead Bank by November 1st, Julian said, sliding a folder across the table that Kozlov's lawyer opened without reading closely, and the corridor's fully operational by Q1. I knew the Halstead Bank covenant. I'd overheard Julian on the phone about it in August, arguing with someone about a September 30th deadline. I also knew, because I still read the trades my old colleagues at Ashcombe and Reyes occasionally forwarded me out of habit, that Vance Shipping had quietly sold 4 of its 7 cargo vessels to a Cypriot leasing firm back in June. A company cannot run a Rotterdam-Antwerp freight corridor with 3 ships and a promise. Julian was selling Viktor Kozlov a corridor that didn't exist, using a shell company built on my forged signature, funded in part. I would learn later that night, when I finally opened the second folder I hadn't had the courage to open that morning, by a temporary reallocation of £180,000 from the Sophia Vance Irrevocable Trust, the fund set up for our daughter's medical care, which Julian had legal signing authority over as co-trustee. He had taken his daughter's heart surgery fund and put it inside a fraud. Elena, sign here as co-witness, Julian said, sliding a pen toward me along with a 1-page acknowledgement form, the kind of document nobody reads at a dinner table because it looks procedural. I looked at the line where my signature was supposed to go, and I thought about the other signature, the one that already existed on Meridian Cargo Partners Incorporation papers, the one I had never signed. Viktor Kozlov was watching me now, not Julian. Really watching, the way a man watches when he's starting to wonder if he's misjudged a room. I picked up the pen. I did not sign. Elena, Julian said again, softer this time, the warning under the warmth unmistakable to anyone who'd been married to it for 15 years. It's just a formality. I set the pen down on the white tablecloth, folded my hands, and looked at my husband for a long moment before I finally spoke, in the flat, precise, professional voice I hadn't used in front of another human being since I left Ashcombe and Reyes. Before I sign anything, I said, I'd like someone at this table to explain to me why Meridian Cargo Partners already has a signatory page with my name on it, dated 3 weeks before tonight, and why the capital behind it traces back to our daughter's medical trust. The table went completely silent. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Kozlov's lawyer looked up from the folder for the first time all evening. And somewhere near the entrance to the private dining room, though none of them had noticed him yet, a man I recognized from a decade-old case file walked in wearing a plain gray suit and carrying a leather folder of his own. Marcus Stone had found me first. I just hadn't expected him to find me here, tonight, at exactly the moment I finally decided to stop being invisible. Marcus Stone didn't come to our table right away. He stopped at the maitre d' station near the entrance, said something quiet that made the young man behind it go pale, and then simply waited, hands folded in front of him, watching our table the way he used to watch surveillance footage back when we worked cases together, patient, unreadable, already 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room except me. I recognized him before Julian did. 10 years is a long time, but you don't forget the man who trained you to spot a falsified invoice at 40 paces. Marcus had been my supervisor at Ashcombe and Reyes for 2 years before he left the private sector entirely, and according to the last email I'd gotten from him, a birthday message, 4 years ago, that I'd never properly answered, took a position with the National Crime Agency's Economic Crime Unit. I hadn't told him I would be here tonight. I hadn't told him anything, in fact, in longer than I wanted to admit. Julian finally turned to see what had stolen everyone's attention, and I watched the color leave his face in stages, like a light dimming on a switch. "Who is that?" he said, not really asking me. He was asking the room. Marcus Stone, Viktor Kozlov said, and his voice had changed completely, the practiced warmth of a man closing a $25 million deal gone, replaced by something flatter and far more dangerous. I know this name. That was the first time I understood that whatever Julian had built with Viktor Kozlov, it was not simply a business relationship between a struggling shipping executive and an eager investor. Kozlov knew federal investigators by name. Men who ran clean businesses didn't memorize those names. Marcus crossed the room slowly, and when he reached our table, he didn't look at Julian at all. He looked at me. "Elena," he said. "I need 5 minutes." "She's in the middle of a business dinner," Julian said, standing halfway out of his chair, his voice pitched to sound authoritative and landing somewhere closer to desperate. "Whatever this is, it can wait." "It can't," Marcus said, still looking only at me. "And I think you already know that." I stood. My legs felt strange beneath me, the particular unsteadiness that comes after you've spent an entire evening holding your body perfectly still so nobody notices you shaking. Julian grabbed my wrist as I stepped away from the table, not hard, but with enough pressure that I felt the shape of every year of our marriage compressed into that one grip. "Elena," he said, low enough that only I could hear it. "Whatever you think you saw this morning, you don't understand it." So he knew. He knew I'd been in his laptop. He'd known for hours and said nothing, smiled through an entire dinner, handed me a pen, and asked me to sign my name onto a fraud, all while knowing exactly what I'd found that morning. "I understand it better than you think," I said, and pulled my wrist free. Marcus led me to a small private anteroom off the main dining hall, the kind of space clubs like the Aldermore keep for exactly this purpose, quiet conversations that shouldn't be overheard. He closed the door, set his leather folder on a side table, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. "You look well," he finally said, which was such a strange, ordinary thing to say that I almost laughed. "Marcus, why are you here?" He opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents I recognized instantly, because I'd seen the originals 11 hours earlier on a kitchen counter in Hampstead. The Meridian Cargo Partners Incorporation filing. The signatory page. My old professional license number, my forged signature, printed in the same precise black ink. "The National Crime Agency has been building a file on Viktor Kozlov for 14 months, Marcus said. Suspected laundering through European shipping and logistics fronts. 3 weeks ago, a compliance officer at Halstead Bank flagged an unusual incorporation filing tied to one of their distressed corporate clients. Vance Shipping." He tapped the signatory page. The name on this filing came back attached to a lapsed forensic accounting license from Ashcombe and Reyes. My old firm. I pulled the file because I recognized the license number before I recognized the name on it. "You've had this for 3 weeks, I said. "And you're only telling me now." "I had to be certain you weren't part of it," Marcus said, and he said it gently, but the words still landed like a slap. "Elena, I've been watching your husband for 3 weeks, not you. But I needed to know whether the woman whose forged signature is on a shell company laundering Eastern European capital was actually laundering it herself, or whether she was the person he was planning to blame for it when it collapsed." I sat down in the nearest chair because my legs had finally stopped pretending they could hold me. "He used my old license number," I said, mostly to myself. "He knew Ashcombe and Reyes never fully deactivated it in the central registry. He knew because I told him that, years ago, as a joke. I said it was funny that a license could just sit there, dormant, still technically real." "It's not funny anymore," Marcus said. He told me the rest carefully, watching my face for each new piece the way he used to watch a suspect's face during an interview, checking for the moment recognition became something worse. Vance Shipping's last audited balance sheet, filed in March, showed 7 active cargo vessels. By June, 4 of those vessels had been quietly sold to a leasing company in Limassol, Cyprus, in a transaction structured to avoid triggering a mandatory disclosure to shareholders, because Vance Shipping had no shareholders besides Julian and a silent minority stake held by his late father's estate, which meant no disclosure obligation to anyone but the bank. The Halstead Bank loan covenant required Vance Shipping to maintain a minimum operational fleet of 6 vessels to remain in compliance. With 3 ships left, Julian was in default the moment the June sale closed. He had roughly 4 months to either restore the fleet count on paper or pay down enough of the loan that the covenant no longer mattered. $25 million from Viktor Kozlov would have done both on paper. Because the Rotterdam-Antwerp corridor Julian had pitched at dinner didn't require Vance Shipping's actual ships. It required Meridian Cargo Partners, a company that existed only on paper, to appear to own a fleet leased back from the very Cypriot company Julian had sold his real ships to weeks earlier. Kozlov's money would flow into Meridian, Meridian would lease phantom vessel capacity back to Vance Shipping, Halstead Bank's covenant would look satisfied, and by the time anyone traced the actual cargo movements, or the lack of them, Julian intended to have restructured the debt entirely, using Kozlov's capital to buy himself out from under Halstead altogether. And when it collapsed, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, the way it always does when you're forced to see someone you love as a stranger, when Kozlov or the bank or anyone else came looking for the person who signed Meridian into existence. It would be you, Marcus finished. A woman with a real, if lapsed, forensic accounting license, no current employment, no defense besides my husband asked me to sign things. Elena, that's not a defense. Courts see that argument from complicit spouses every year, and juries rarely believe it, especially when the signature matches a license the defendant genuinely holds. I thought about the £180,000 pulled from Sophia's trust, the second file I still hadn't told Marcus about, because I hadn't fully let myself absorb it yet. Julian hadn't just built a fraud that would collapse onto me. He'd funded part of it with our daughter's heart surgery money, and structured the rest so that when it all fell apart, I would be the one standing in a courtroom explaining a company I'd never heard of, while he sat somewhere far away, having already moved whatever was left. There's something else, I said. Something you don't have in that folder. Marcus went very still, the way he used to when a source was about to give him the piece of a case he'd been missing for months. Tell me. I told him about Sophia's trust. About the co-trustee authority Julian had used it under. About the £180,000 that had left the account for days before the Meridian Incorporation filing, in an amount that matched almost exactly the initial capital figure listed on the very documents sitting in his folder. Marcus wrote nothing down. He simply looked at me, and for the first time since he'd walked into that dining room, something like anger moved across his face, not at me, but on my behalf, the particular fury of a man who has just watched a colleague he respects get used as a weapon against her own child. Elena, he said quietly, if that money came out of an irrevocable trust without proper trustee documentation, that's not just fraud against Kozlov and Halstead Bank. That's theft from a minor's protected account. That's a different category of charge entirely, and it changes everything about how fast we need to move. Through the anteroom's thin wall, I could hear Julian's voice rising in the main dining room, sharp and performative, telling Kozlov something about a family misunderstanding, and nothing that affects tonight's agreement. He was still trying to close the deal. Even now, with a federal investigator 10 feet away, my husband was still trying to sell Viktor Kozlov a corridor built on ships that no longer existed, and a signature that was never mine. He doesn't know I've told you about Sophia's trust, I said. No, Marcus agreed. And that gives us something he doesn't expect us to have. I looked at the folder on the table between us, the forged signature, the shell company, the paper trail leading straight to a fraud my husband had built with my name, and my daughter's future, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with fear anymore. What do you need from me, I said, to make sure it's him standing in that courtroom, and not me? Marcus closed the folder slowly, and for the first time all evening, he almost smiled. I need you to go back out to that table, he said, sit down, and let your husband believe, for exactly one more week, that you still don't understand any of this. I went back to the table that night and finished my dessert. I laughed at a joke Viktor Kozlov's lawyer made about London traffic. I let Julian rest his hand on the back of my chair the way he always did, when he wanted a room to see a united front. I said good night to Kozlov with a smile that had cost me every ounce of composure I had left, and in the car home, when Julian reached over and squeezed my knee and said, See, that wasn't so bad, was it? I told him he was right. That was the last easy sentence I said to my husband for 11 days. Marcus had given me one instruction before I walked back into that dining room: change nothing. Don't confront him, don't withdraw, don't let a single day of our routine look different from the outside. Fraud cases collapse, he told me, when the person building them senses they've been discovered. Give him no reason to suspect it. Every day you buy us is a day we can trace where the money actually goes next. So I became, for 11 days, the woman Julian had always believed I was. The first thing I learned that week wasn't about Meridian Cargo Partners at all. On the Tuesday after the dinner, I drove to Sophia's cardiology appointment at Great Ormond Street alone, the way I always did, and while I sat in the waiting room I called the trust's administering solicitor, a woman named Priya Chandra at a firm in Holborn who had handled the account since Sophia's diagnosis. I told her I wanted a full transaction history for the trust going back 18 months, framing it as a routine check before Sophia's next procedure. What Priya sent me that evening wasn't routine at all. The £180,000 withdrawal I'd already found wasn't the only one. There had been two smaller transfers before it, £40,000 in April and £25,000 in July, both authorized under Julian's co-trustee signature, both logged as medical reserve reallocation, a category that didn't exist anywhere in the trust's actual governing documents. Combined with the October withdrawal, Julian had pulled £245,000 out of our daughter's protected medical fund over 6 months, leaving a balance that, according to Priya's email, would not fully cover the fourth cardiac procedure her doctors were recommending before Sophia's 16th birthday. He hadn't just funded a fraud with our daughter's money once. He'd been doing it in pieces for half a year, betting that I would never look closely enough to notice the fund shrinking, because I had never once, in 15 years, been given a reason to distrust him with it. I didn't cry in that waiting room. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to at that dinner table, and I forwarded Priya's email to Marcus with 4 words, started in April, not October. His reply came back within minutes: this changes the charge. Keep going. Don't tell him. The second thing I learned came from a place I hadn't expected: Julian's sister, Rosalind. Rosalind Vance Whitfield had never particularly liked me. She'd made that clear at our wedding, in a toast that managed to compliment Julian's resilience for 14 sentences without once mentioning me by name. But Rosalind also handled the family's estate matters since their father's death 3 years earlier, and on the Thursday of that quiet week, she called me directly, which she had done perhaps 4 times in the entire span of my marriage. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to be honest, because I don't think Julian is being honest with me. Their father, Edmund Vance, had left the family a minority stake in Vance Shipping, 18%, held jointly in a trust for Julian, Rosalind, and their younger brother, Thomas, who lived in Singapore and had no involvement in the company. Under the terms of Edmund's will, any transaction affecting more than 10% of the company's total asset value required sign-off from all 3 siblings as trust beneficiaries. The Meridian Cargo Partners arrangement, Rosalind told me, had crossed her desk 2 weeks earlier for exactly that reason, and Julian had asked her to sign off on it quickly, telling her it was a routine financing structure that didn't materially affect the estate's position. I signed it, Rosalind said, and I could hear something unfamiliar in her voice, not warmth, but something close to it. Fear, maybe, dressed up as irritation. I signed it because he's my brother and I trust him. But I've been going through the numbers myself this week because something felt wrong, and Elena, the fleet valuation in that document doesn't match what I know about the company. We don't have 7 ships anymore, do we? I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, weighing exactly how much of the truth I was allowed to give her under Marcus's instructions, and decided that Rosalind Vance Whitfield, whatever she thought of me, was not someone Julian had told the truth to either. No, I said. We have 3. The silence on the other end of the line lasted almost 20 seconds. He asked me to sign off on a company that doesn't have the assets it claims to have, Rosalind finally said, using our father's estate as partial collateral for the loan restructuring. If that filing collapses, Elena, it's not just his exposure. It's mine. It's Thomas's. It's every penny our father left us. I didn't tell her about Meridian's signatory page yet, or the forged license, or Sophia's trust. I told her only what I needed to, and asked her to send me a copy of whatever documentation Julian had shown her to secure her sign-off. She sent it within the hour, without asking why, which told me more about how frightened she'd become than anything she'd said out loud. The third thing I learned by accident, on the Saturday of that quiet week, when Julian left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a message from a lawyer named Desmond Okafor lit up the screen. Draft custody petition ready for your review. Given the financial instability concerns you've outlined regarding Elena's mental state and spending patterns, we have a strong preliminary position. Recommend filing before year-end, ideally before any joint asset disclosures are required in the Meridian matter. We'll need supporting documentation of the incidents you described. I read it twice, standing perfectly still in my own kitchen, and understood, in a way that reorganized every assumption I'd built my marriage on, exactly what my husband's real plan had been all along. Julian wasn't simply planning to let me take the fall for Meridian Cargo Partners if it collapsed. He was preparing, in parallel, to have me declared financially unstable and psychologically unfit, so that if the fraud ever surfaced and investigators came asking questions, the story waiting for them would already be written. An unwell, spending erratic wife who had used her old professional license to build a shell company without her husband's knowledge, while he filed for emergency custody of their vulnerable daughter to protect her from a mother who could no longer be trusted. He wasn't planning to blame me for the fraud as an afterthought. He was building the case against me before I'd even known there was one to defend against. I photographed the message with my own phone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and deleted nothing from his. Then I made dinner, because that was the routine, and when Julian came downstairs he kissed the top of my head and asked what smelled so good, and I told him I'd found a new recipe, and he believed me, because he had spent 15 years training himself to see exactly what he wanted to see. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in Sophia's doorway for a long time, and watched her sleeping, one hand curled near her face the way she'd slept since she was small enough to fit in my arms during those hospital nights. I never told anyone how frightened I had been. I sent Marcus one more message before I finally slept myself. He's not just planning to let the fraud land on me. He's building a custody case to take Sophia while he does it. I need to know exactly what we're going to do about that, and I need to know it before the week is over, because I am done letting him decide what happens to my daughter's future while I sit quietly and hold a wine glass. Marcus's reply arrived just after 2 a.m., 3 words that told me the quiet week was finally, deliberately, coming to an end. Meet me tomorrow. Marcus met me the next morning in a small conference room above a coffee shop in Bloomsbury, the kind of space the National Crime Agency uses when it wants a conversation to look like nothing at all. He wasn't alone. Beside him sat a woman he introduced as Detective Inspector Farah Delacroix, who handled financial crimes against minors, the specific unit that existed because of exactly what Julian had done to Sophia's trust, and a third person I hadn't expected to see in that room at all, Rosalind. She called us Sunday night, Marcus said before I could ask. After you sent her the fleet numbers. She'd already gone through her father's estate documents on her own, and found the same gap you found. She came to us before we came to her. Rosalind looked at me across the table, and for the first time in 15 years, there was nothing performative in her expression at all. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing it because our father built the company for 30 years, and my brother is burning it down to cover a debt he's too proud to admit he can't pay. But I imagine, this once, we want the same thing. I told them everything that Quiet Week had given me. The trust withdrawals going back to April. Rosalind's estate documentation showing the fleet valuation Julian had submitted for sibling sign-off. The custody petition draft sitting on Desmond Okafor's desk, ready to file the moment the Meridian deal either closed or collapsed. Delacroix listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she opened a folder of her own. We've had banking records on Meridian Cargo Partners since the Halstead compliance flag 3 weeks ago, she said. What we didn't have until this week was proof of intent, evidence that Julian Vance knew the fleet didn't exist and built the structure anyway, specifically to defraud Kozlov's investment and default-proof himself against Halstead. Your documentation, combined with the trust withdrawal pattern, gives us that. There's a signing ceremony Wednesday, I said. Kozlov's lawyers finalize the transfer. Julian's expecting me to be there as co-witness, exactly like the dinner. Delacroix and Marcus exchanged a look I recognized from a decade earlier, the look investigators give each other when a case that's been circling for months suddenly has a date on it. Then Wednesday, Delacroix said, is when we move. I didn't sleep the night before the signing. I lay beside a man I had shared a bed with for 15 years, listening to him breathe, thinking about the 11-year-old girl I'd once been who used to sit in the corner of her mother's kitchen doing sums for fun, who grew up to spend a decade catching people exactly like the one asleep next to her, and who had somehow convinced herself that loving someone meant making her own competence small enough to fit inside his ego. At 6 in the morning, Julian kissed my forehead on his way to the shower and said, "Big day. You'll be brilliant, like always, just sit, smile, sign where I show you." I will, I told him, and for the last time in our marriage, I let him believe I meant it the way he wanted me to. The Vance shipping boardroom on the 11th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Thames was full by 10 a.m. Julian, Victor Kozlov, Kozlov's 2 lawyers, Vance Shipping's outside counsel, and me seated exactly where Julian directed, beside a stack of closing documents an inch thick. Champagne sat unopened on a side table. Julian had ordered it the day before, confident enough in Wednesday's outcome that he'd already told his assistant to have it chilled by 9:25 million, transferring on execution, Kozlov's lead lawyer said, sliding the final signature page toward Julian. Corridor operational Q1 per section 4. Julian signed first, his handwriting looping and confident, a man closing the deal that would erase for months of quiet panic he'd never once let me see. Then he slid the page to me. Co-witness signature here, he said, tapping the line beneath his own. Just like we discussed. I picked up the pen. I looked at the line. And then, exactly as I had 11 days earlier, I set it down. Before I sign this, I said, in the same flat, precise voice I'd used at the Aldermore Club, except this time I let it carry through the entire room. I'd like to walk everyone here through clause 4B, because I don't think Mr. Kozlov's team has been given accurate information about the assets securing this transfer. Julian's hand closed over my wrist under the table, a warning, the same grip from the dinner, except this time I didn't let it stop me. Vance Shipping's last audited filing listed 7 cargo vessels, I said. 4 of them were sold to a leasing company in Limassol in June, in a transaction structured specifically to avoid triggering shareholder disclosure. The corridor described in Section 4 of this agreement requires a minimum operational fleet of 6 ships under the Halstead Bank covenant my husband is racing to satisfy. Vance Shipping currently owns 3. Silence dropped over the room the way it had at the club, total, immediate, the particular silence of a deal recognizing its own collapse in real time. That's not accurate, Julian said, too loudly, standing halfway out of his chair. She doesn't understand the structure, she's not, Elena, sit down. The company you believe is providing leased vessel capacity to cover that shortfall, I continued, not sitting down, is Meridian Cargo Partners, incorporated 3 weeks before our dinner at the Aldermore Club, using a signatory page that lists my name, and a forensic accounting license I let lapse in 2011. I never signed that document. My husband forged it, using a license number he only knew because I once told him it was still technically active in the central registry. Kozlov's lawyer had stopped moving entirely. And the initial capital that funded Meridian's incorporation, I said, my voice not shaking at all now, £180,000 of it, along with 65,000 more moved out over the previous 6 months, came from an irrevocable medical trust established for our 15-year-old daughter's cardiac care. He is short of the balance she needs for her next surgery because he used her medical fund to build the shell company he intended to blame on me the moment this deal collapsed. She's lying, Julian said, his voice cracking now, the performance finally failing him in front of the only audience that had ever mattered to him. This is exactly what I told you, Victor, she has no idea what any of this means, she's confused, she's not well. There's a custody petition, I said, drafted by Desmond Okafor, ready to file the moment this deal either closed or fell apart, citing my supposed financial instability as grounds to take our daughter from me. I have the message. I have the trust records. I have Rosalind's estate documentation showing the fleet valuation you submitted for sibling sign-off doesn't match reality by 4 vessels. Viktor Kozlov stood up slowly, and when he spoke, whatever warmth had existed at that first dinner was entirely gone. You told me, he said to Julian, that your wife signs where you point and understands nothing. You told me she was the safest part of this arrangement. Viktor. You built a fraud on top of a fraud, Kozlov said, and you were prepared to let it collapse onto a woman who apparently understood exactly what you were doing before you finished doing it. He picked up the signature page Julian had already signed, tore it once, cleanly, down the middle, and dropped both halves on the table. I have no interest in a corridor built on ships that do not exist. The double doors at the far end of the boardroom opened and Marcus walked in first, followed by Detective Inspector Delacroix and 2 uniformed officers. Marcus's eyes found mine for just a moment, a small nod, nothing more, the kind of acknowledgement 2 people share when a case they've built together finally lands. Julian Vance, Delacroix said, crossing the room while her officers moved to either side of his chair, you're being arrested on suspicion of fraud by false representation, forgery, and unauthorized withdrawal from a protected trust account. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Julian looked at me while they read the rest of it, his face doing something I'd never seen it do in 15 years of marriage, not anger, not performance, just a kind of collapsing bewilderment, the look of a man realizing, too late, that the person he'd spent a decade underestimating had been keeping better records than he had. Elena, he said, quiet now, almost pleading. I did this for us. For the company. For Sophia's future. You did this to Sophia's future, I said. There's a difference, and you knew it the entire time. You were moving her medical fund into a shell company with my forged name on it. I reached into my bag, took out the folder I'd been carrying since 6 that morning, and set it on the table in front of him. Divorce papers, prepared over the weekend by a solicitor Rosalind had recommended, someone with no history with either of us and no reason to see me as anything other than what I actually was. Sign here, I said as co-witness. They led him out of the boardroom in handcuffs while the champagne sat unopened on the side table, condensation sliding down a bottle nobody would ever drink. 3 months later, I sat in the reopened offices of Vance Forensic Partners, a small firm, for employees, occupying 2 floors above the Holborn office where Priya Chandra still managed Sophia's trust, now restored under a court-ordered guardianship that kept it entirely out of Julian's reach. Sophia's 4th procedure had gone well in December. She was back at school, back to complaining about maths homework instead of hospital corridors, and for the first time in 6 months, I fell asleep at night without doing mental arithmetic on numbers that weren't mine to fix alone. Rosalind and I had lunch every few weeks now, an arrangement neither of us would have predicted a year earlier, built on the strange, durable respect that grows between 2 people who once discovered, together and independently, that they'd been lied to by the same men in different rooms. She'd taken over as interim chair of what remained of Vance Shipping's restructured board, working with what few honest assets the company had left, determined that her father's 30 years of work would survive her brother's 4 months of desperation. Julian's trial was scheduled for the spring. Marcus told me the trust theft charge alone, given the age of the victim and the deliberateness of the withdrawal pattern, carried a sentencing range that would likely keep him away from any boardroom for a very long time. I don't think about the necklace anymore, the one he had delivered without a card the morning of that dinner, the one that sat around my neck while he told a dangerous man that I understood nothing. I gave it to Delacroix's evidence team eventually. It turned out to have been purchased with funds traceable to the same Meridian account, one more small piece of a case that had, in the end, needed every piece it could get. My husband believed, for 15 years, that I was the quiet part of our marriage, the part that sat, smiled, and signed where he pointed. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was quiet. I was quiet the way an auditor is quiet before she opens the file that ends everything.